Jordan and Mason had been best friends since the 7th grade, the kind of friendship that survives bad haircuts, embarrassing crushes, and the slow, awkward crawl of growing up. They had met in Mr. Peterson's science class when Mason accidentally knocked Jordan's project off the table, a carefully constructed model of the solar system that took 3 weekends to build, and instead of apologizing properly, Mason had laughed so hard that Jordan, despite every intention to be furious, had started laughing too. That was the beginning. That laugh was the foundation of everything. By the time they were 24, they had survived high school together, chosen colleges in the same city almost by accident, shared a crumbling apartment for 2 years after graduation, and somehow remained the kind of friends who could go 3 weeks without talking and then pick up exactly where they left off, as if no time had passed at all. Jordan was a graphic designer working freelance from his laptop, usually in coffee shops or on his couch in sweatpants. Mason worked in construction management, which meant he was always tan, always slightly tired, and always smelling faintly of sawdust in a way that Jordan had long since decided not to think too hard about. Jordan was gay. He had known it since he was 15, had come out to his parents at 17, and had been openly, comfortably out for years. Most of his friend group knew. Mason knew. Mason had known for 6 years, had reacted with exactly the kind of casual, unfazed acceptance that Jordan had hoped for, and somehow not expected, had said, "Yeah, okay, cool. Does that mean you're buying dinner tonight? Because I feel like that's a coming out tradition," and that had been that. They had never made it weird. Or rather, Jordan had tried very hard to never make it weird. And Mason, being Mason, had never seemed to notice there was anything to make weird in the first place. The hike was Mason's idea, which was unusual because Mason was not typically an outdoors for fun kind of person. He liked being outside when it involved a purpose, a construction site, a backyard barbecue, throwing a football in a parking lot. But hiking, the deliberate act of walking into nature for no practical reason, was not usually his thing. Jordan, on the other hand, had been hiking casually for a couple of years, mostly solo. Mostly as a way to get away from screens and think. So when Mason texted him on a Thursday evening and said, "Hey, you still do that hiking thing? Want to go Saturday? I need to get out of my head." Jordan had said yes without hesitation, the way he always said yes to Mason. Because that was just how it was between them. They chose Ridgeback Trail, about 40 minutes outside the city. Jordan had done it once before, maybe 18 months ago, and remembered it as manageable but rewarding. A 5-mile loop that climbed gradually through pine forests before opening up at a ridge with a wide, unobstructed view of the valley below. He told Mason to wear proper shoes, which Mason interpreted as wearing his least beat-up pair of work boots, and to bring water, which Mason interpreted as bringing 1 bottle that was probably not enough. Jordan packed a small backpack with 2 extra water bottles, sunscreen, a light jacket, trail mix, and a basic first aid kit. Because one of them had to be a functional adult, Saturday morning was the kind of morning that felt like a promise. The sky was a deep, unbroken blue when Jordan pulled up to Mason's apartment complex at 7:30. The air still cool and carrying that particular freshness that only exists before the day has fully committed to being warm. Mason was already outside, sitting on the front steps in his work boots and a gray Henley with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, scrolling his phone. He looked up when Jordan's car pulled in, and something about the way he smiled immediate, unhesitant, like he'd been waiting and was genuinely glad the wait was over, made Jordan's chest do a quiet, familiar thing that he had gotten very good at ignoring. "You're on time," Mason said, getting in the passenger seat and tossing his single water bottle in the back. "I'm always on time," Jordan said. "You were 40 minutes late to my cousin's wedding. That was years ago, and I had a legitimate excuse. You forgot to charge your phone and couldn't use GPS." "Is a legitimate excuse," Jordan said, and pulled out of the parking lot. They talked the whole drive, the way they always did. Conversation jumping without logic from Mason's frustration with a subcontractor who kept missing deadlines, to a documentary Jordan had watched about deep-sea creatures, to a debate about whether or not it was acceptable to put pineapple on pizza that somehow became surprisingly heated. Mason had the radio on low and drummed his fingers on the door in the absent, unconscious way he did when he was relaxed, and Jordan kept his eyes on the road and felt, as he often did in these ordinary moments with Mason, a complicated mixture of complete contentment and something much quieter and more difficult that lived underneath it. He had been in love with Mason for almost 2 years. He had not told anyone. He had barely admitted it to himself for the first several months, filing it away under inconvenient feelings to deal with. Never, because Mason was straight. Mason was his best friend. And Jordan was not the kind of person who let himself want things that would cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. He had dated other people in those 2 years, 2 short relationships that had both ended without much drama. One guy he'd met through an app, one through a mutual friend, and he had liked both of them genuinely and had felt each time the faint disappointment of caring about someone and it still not quite measuring up to something he wasn't supposed to be measuring it against. He had decided somewhere around month 8 of quietly loving Mason that this was just something he would carry, and eventually it would fade, the way feelings did when you stopped feeding them. He was still waiting for that to happen. The trailhead parking lot was mostly empty when they arrived. Just a couple of other cars, a minivan with a bike rack. The air was noticeably cooler here, the elevation higher, the trees denser. Mason got out and stretched, tilting his head back to look up through the canopy, and said, "Okay, I get it." "Get what?" Jordan asked, pulling on his backpack. "Why people do this? It smells different out here. It smells like trees. It smells like it's not the city," Mason said, which Jordan thought was actually a pretty precise way to put it. The first mile of the trail was easy, wide enough to walk side by side. The path carpeted with pine needles and broken by occasional roots that you had to step over without thinking too hard. They walked slowly at first, warming up, still talking about nothing in particular, about everything. Mason told Jordan about a girl he'd been seeing casually for a month, someone named Priya, who worked in marketing, and said it wasn't really going anywhere. And Jordan listened and asked the right questions and felt the familiar small ache of that particular conversation and let it pass through him the way he always did. He had gotten good at letting it pass through him around the 1.5 mile mark. The trail began to narrow and climb more seriously, and conversation became less constant, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of breathing and footfall. Jordan had always liked this part of hiking, the way the body took over and the mind went quiet. The way you stopped performing yourself and just existed in the movement. He glanced over at Mason occasionally, watching him navigate the trail with the careful, deliberate attention of someone unused to uneven terrain, and felt an uncomplicated affection that was the easiest thing in the world to feel. They stopped at a small creek crossing around mile 2. Sitting on a flat rock at the water's edge to drink and catch their breath. The creek was shallow and clear, running fast over smooth stones, and the sound of it filled the air around them in a way that made everything else feel muffled and far away. Mason refilled his nearly empty water bottle from Jordan's spare, and they sat quietly for a few minutes, which was unusual for them. They were not typically quiet people together, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like the place and the morning had created a kind of permission for stillness. "Can I ask you something?" Mason said, watching the water. "You never ask if you can ask. You just ask, 'This is different.'" Jordan looked at him. Mason was still looking at the creek, turning his water bottle slowly in his hands. "Okay," Jordan said. "When you were figuring things out, like when you were coming to terms with being gay, was there a specific moment? Like, was it one thing, or was it just gradual?" Jordan was quiet for a moment, considering the question and its source. Mason had never asked him anything like this before. Not because they didn't talk about real things. They did. But because the topic of Jordan's sexuality had always lived comfortably in the background. Acknowledged and unremarkable, not something that required revisiting. "Gradual," he said finally. "There were specific moments that kind of pushed the understanding along. But it was mostly the slow accumulation of realizing that the way I thought about certain people was different from how I was supposed to think about them." "Why?" Mason didn't answer right away. He picked up a small stone and turned it over in his fingers. "I've just been thinking lately about some stuff." Jordan waited. He knew Mason well enough to know that pushing produced nothing, and patience produced everything. "About how I feel about people," Mason said. "Some people specifically. Like, whether what I feel is just normal friendship stuff, or something different." Jordan's heart was very still all of a sudden. Carefully still. "Different how?" Mason put the stone down. "I don't know. That's kind of the problem." He finally looked at Jordan, and his expression was something Jordan had never quite seen on him before. Open, certain a little raw. "I've never talked about this with anyone." "You can talk to me," Jordan said. "Obviously. Yeah." Mason looked back at the water. "There's this guy at work. Callum. He started about 4 months ago. And from the beginning, I noticed him differently than I notice other people. Like, I'd find reasons to be in the same space. I'd think about things I wanted to tell him. And then I started noticing that I felt kind of weird when he talked about women he was interested in. And I couldn't figure out if that was just some competitive guy thing, or he stopped." Jordan was very quiet. "And I keep trying to convince myself it's just because he's a good guy and I like having him around, as a friend. But it doesn't feel like that. It feels like," Mason paused again. "It feels like when you really want someone to notice you exist. Not in a general way. In a specific way, it's a real thing," Jordan said. His voice was steady. He was proud of how steady his voice was. "I know." Mason ran a hand through his hair. "It's just I've never felt this before. Or I don't think I have. Maybe I have, and I just labeled it as something else." He let out a slow breath. "This is weird to talk about." "It's not," Jordan said. "I promise it's not weird." "I don't know what I am," Mason said. "I feel stupid even saying that at 24. "You're not stupid." "That's not a deadline, Mason. There's no deadline for knowing yourself." Mason looked at him again, and some of the tension in his face eased, like a knot loosening by one thread. Does it feel different? Liking a guy versus a girl? Emotionally, I mean?" Jordan considered this honestly. "I think the feeling itself feels the same. The wanting to be around someone, the noticing everything they do, the way they take up space in your head, even when you're trying to think about something else. I think that's just what it feels like to have real feelings for someone, regardless of who they are." Mason was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. Yeah. He stood up, dusting off the back of his jeans. "Okay, sorry for dumping that on you. Stop apologizing." "You didn't dump anything on me?" "That's what I'm here for." Mason looked at him for a beat, something soft and a little undone in his expression. "Yeah," he said again, quieter this time. "I know." They kept walking. The trail steepened considerably in the 3rd mile, switchbacking up the side of the ridge through thinner trees, the valley beginning to appear in glimpses between the trunks below them. They walked single file here, Jordan in front, and the conversation became lighter again, safer things. Easier things, but something had shifted in the air between them. Not uncomfortably, just noticeably, like a room where someone has opened a window. Jordan was turning the conversation over in his mind quietly as he walked, cataloging it, trying to understand what he felt about it. Relief on Mason's behalf that he had somewhere safe to put this. Careful, controlled hope that he immediately recognized as dangerous and tried to set aside. Mostly just a deep tenderness for his best friend, who'd been carrying something unfamiliar and had chosen Jordan to carry it with. Whatever this meant or didn't mean for Mason, whatever was or wasn't happening inside him that felt like the most important thing, that Mason had trusted him. That was the thing that mattered. They reached the ridge just before 11, stepping out of the tree line onto a broad, flat outcropping of rock that opened onto a view so wide and unobstructed that Mason actually stopped walking and went silent for several seconds. The valley spread below them in every direction, green and gold in the late morning light, a river visible as a thin silver line far below. The faint outline of the city, a smudge on the horizon. The sky above was the same deep blue as the drive over, cloudless and enormous. "Okay," Mason said finally. "Yeah, okay. This was worth it." Jordan smiled. "I told you. You didn't tell me it would look like this." I didn't want to oversell it. You dramatically undersold it. Mason turned in a slow circle, taking it in. I feel like a completely different person up here. Altitude does that. It's not the altitude. Mason sat down on the rock, a little back from the edge, and Jordan sat beside him, setting down the backpack and pulling out the trail mix. For a while they just sat and looked out at the valley together, passing the bag of trail mix back and forth. And it was quiet in the way that only really open spaces can be quiet, not empty, but full of a different kind of sound. Whined through the pine trees, a bird somewhere below them, their own breathing. Can I tell you something? Jordan said. He had not planned to say it. He had, in fact, spent 2 years specifically not saying it. But something about the morning, about Mason's honesty at the creek, about the altitude and the wide open sky, had dissolved some of the careful architecture he'd built around this particular thing. Yeah, Mason said. Jordan looked out at the valley. I've had feelings for someone for a while. About 2 years. Someone I probably shouldn't have feelings for, in terms of practicality. You could feel Mason looking at him. Someone unavailable. Someone I thought was unavailable, Jordan said carefully. Someone I've been really intentional about not saying anything to, because the friendship mattered more than the feeling. And that was the right call. I still think that's the right call. But he stopped, breathed. I don't know. You were honest with me today, and I guess I wanted to be honest back. Silence. Not uncomfortable, but weighted. Jordan kept his eyes on the horizon. Jordan, Mason said. You don't have to, Jordan. Mason's voice was different, quieter. Jordan finally looked at him. Mason was watching him with an expression that was a little undone in a different way than it had been at the creek, less uncertain. It's more like someone standing at the edge of something and deciding whether to step. Is it me? Jordan held his gaze. He had rehearsed many versions of how he might handle this hypothetical moment over the past 2 years, and in none of them had he managed to be particularly cool about it. You don't have to make it weird, he said, which was both a deflection and an answer. I'm not trying to make it weird. Mason's voice was very steady. I'm asking because I want to know why. Because of the conversation we just had at the creek. Jordan was quiet for a moment. His heart was doing something he was trying not to pay too much attention to. Yeah, he said finally. It's you. It has been for a while. And I know you're figuring stuff out, and I'm not. I don't want you to feel like there's any pressure. Or like I've been. I need you to know that none of it has been. I've never let it get in the way of Jordan. Mason stopped him. Stop managing it. What? You're doing the thing where you take up as little space as possible so nobody has to deal with your feelings. Stop it. Jordan blinked. It was such a precisely accurate thing to say that he didn't have an immediate response to it. Mason looked back at the valley. His jaw was working slightly the way it did when he was thinking hard. I told you there was a guy at work I was figuring out how I felt about, he said. I wasn't being completely honest.
Out.
I mean, there is a guy, but he's not at work. Mason paused. I've been trying to figure out how to understand what I feel because I've spent the last however long pretending it was just, that it wasn't what it is. Telling myself a different story because the real story was one I didn't know what to do with. He was quiet. It's easier to invent a hypothetical than to say the actual thing. Jordan's breathing had gone very deliberate and careful. I don't know exactly what I am, Mason said. I meant that part. That was true. But I know how I feel when I'm around you. I've known it for a while. He stopped. Started again. You're the safest person I've ever known. And somehow that made this harder, not easier, because I couldn't risk getting it wrong. Jordan said very quietly, You're not getting it wrong. Mason looked at him. The light up here was different than it was in the city, cleaner, more direct. And it did something to Mason's face that Jordan was aware he was cataloging in a way he didn't normally let himself. I don't know what I'm doing, Mason said. I need you to know that. I can't promise that I have any of this figured out. Neither can I, Jordan said. I've been in love with my straight best friend for 2 years. My self-awareness has clear limits. Something shifted in Mason's expression, the last of the tension releasing, replaced by something warmer and startlingly open. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. God, This is terrifying. Yeah, Jordan agreed. Does it get less terrifying? I'll let you know once I've experienced a version of it that didn't involve telling you on top of a mountain by accident. Mason laughed then. A real one, the kind Jordan had loved since 7th grade. And the sound of it went out over the ridge and dissolved into the open air. He shook his head. By accident, he repeated. Sure, mostly by accident. It's the most romantic story ever told. As they sat with it for a while. The thing that had just happened, settling around them like the quiet after the laugh.